Welcome to the Sleepkeeper's library. I'm the Mythkeeper, guardian of the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Something rare has happened in this ancient place. We three keepers usually tend our collections in quiet solitude, each absorbed in our particular corner of preserved knowledge. But as October settled over the library like a veil, the boundaries between our domains began to blur. That evening, we gathered around the central hearth, where the fire burns with shifting light. We soon came to understand our collections of choice that evening had found a convergence. The historian shared records documenting those who crafted tools to speak with the dead. The wanderer explained his recent journey, explored worlds where such tools actually worked. And my shelves hummed with the myths that inspired it all. The ancient stories that warned us about opening doors and crossing thresholds. The season itself seemed to have orchestrated this meeting. October makes even the most rational minds wonder about shadows and whispers, about whether the dead truly rest, or whether they linger just beyond perception. And the myths I guard know this truth. Every culture's myths know it. There are boundaries between the living and the dead, and those boundaries demand respect. So this week, all three keepers are exploring the same dark thread. The historian has shared the craft of spirit cabinets and photographic plates. The wanderer has walked through Edinburgh, where cameras could capture more than light. And I will open my volumes to show you what humanity has always known about thresholds, about guardians, about the dangerous act of looking where we should not look. Tonight, I'll take you on a journey through the world's mythologies, not just stories, but patterns. Universal human understanding expressed through different voices, different gods, different cultural fears, that all circle the same essential truth. The boundary between life and death is sacred, and every attempt to cross it comes with a price. Settle in. Let my voice carry you through ancient Greece and Egypt, through Norse halls and Japanese shrines, through Mexican festivals and Irish crossroads. Let these stories wash over you like waves, each one adding another layer to your understanding of what our ancestors knew. That death is not an ending, but a threshold, and every threshold has its guardians. We begin where many Western minds begin when they think of death, with a river, a ferryman, and a coin placed beneath the tongue. The ancient Greeks understood death as a journey, and like all journeys, it required passage across water. The River Styx wound through the underworld, a boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And at the river's edge waited Charon, the ferryman, ancient and silent and utterly necessary. Charon was not a god, but something more fundamental, a function of the universe itself. Now he ferried souls across the water, but only if they could pay. This is why the dead were buried, with coins placed in their mouths or on their eyes, payment for the ferryman. Those who could not pay were left to wander the shores for 100 years before Charon would finally, grudgingly, ferry them across without payment. Think about what this myth reveals. Death is not free passage. It requires something of the living, a final gesture of respect and preparation. The coin represents the living's acknowledgement that the dead must move on, that the boundary must be crossed, that we cannot keep our loved ones on this shore forever. Charon himself is described in the myths as grim and terrible, with eyes like coals, dressed in ragged robes. He speaks little, demands much, and allows no argument. He is the personification of death's inevitability and impersonality. He does not care who you were in life, what you accomplished, what you loved or feared. You are simply cargo now, a shade to be ferried across dark water. But here's what's fascinating. Charon is also protection. He guards the boundary not just to keep the dead in, but to keep the living out. In the rare myths where living heroes journey to the underworld, like Orpheus or Aeneas, they must find ways to bypass or convince Charon, because he fundamentally does not want the living in his boat. The boundary is meant to be crossed only once, in one direction. Travel east to ancient Egypt, and you'll find a different guardian of the threshold, but one serving the same essential function. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, presided over the weighing of the heart, the moment when the dead discovered whether they could proceed to the afterlife or would be devoured by Amit, the soul-eating demon. In Egyptian mythology, death was not the end of judgment, but the beginning of it. The deceased's heart was placed on one side of a scale, while Mayat's feather of truth was placed on the other. If the heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by lies and cruelty and untruth, Amit would consume it utterly. If the heart balanced with the feather, the deceased could proceed to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Anubis's role was to oversee this process with absolute impartiality. He was the guardian of the threshold between death and afterlife, ensuring that only those who had lived truthfully could pass through. Unlike Charon, who simply ferried everyone regardless of their deeds, Anubis represented the idea that how we live determines where we go after death. But Anubis was also a protector of the dead in another sense. He was the god of mummification, the one who taught humans how to preserve bodies so the soul would have something to return to. In this way, Anubis guarded both the threshold of death itself and the physical remains left behind, ensuring they were treated with the proper reverence. The Egyptians' elaborate death rituals, their careful preservation of bodies, their detailed instructions for navigating the afterlife, all of this speaks to a deep understanding that death is not a simple moment, but a complex transition, requiring guidance, preparation, and respect for proper boundaries. Now travel north to the frozen lands of Norse mythology, where death in battle was not feared but sought, because it meant being chosen by the Valkyries, Odin's warrior women, who flew over battlefields selecting the worthy dead. The Valkyries are threshold guardians of a different sort. They don't wait at a river or judge the heart. They actively choose, swooping down from the sky to claim the souls of warriors who died with courage. Those chosen would be carried to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of all things. But here's what's often missed about the Valkyries. They embody the idea that death's meaning depends on how you face it. Die well, die bravely, and death is not an ending, but a promotion, a movement to a better realm. Die poorly, die in your bed of old age or sickness, and you go instead to hell's cold halls, unremarkable and unmourned. The Valkyries also reveal something crucial about threshold guardians. They have their own criteria, their own standards for who passes, and who doesn't. They are not neutral like Charon. They choose, they judge, they enforce cosmic rules about valor and cowardice, about how death should be met. In Japanese Shinto tradition, the threshold between life and death is guarded not by a single figure, but by the torii gates themselves, the sacred gateways that mark the boundary between the mundane and the sacred. Passing through a torii means entering a space where the normal rules don't apply, where the spirit world overlaps with our own. At Japanese funeral rites and in the mythology surrounding death, there's a deep understanding that the dead must be helped across the threshold through proper ritual. The Bon Festival, when ancestors' spirits return to visit the living, requires careful preparation. Lanterns lit to guide the spirits home, offerings of food and drink, dances to welcome them. And then, at festival's end, floating lanterns released on water to guide the spirits back to the realm of the dead. This reveals a different understanding of the threshold. It's not permanently sealed. Once a year, it opens. The dead can visit, but only if the living perform the proper rituals to guide them safely there and back. The guardianship here is shared between the living and the dead, a mutual respect for the boundary and the careful protocols that allow it to be temporarily, safely crossed. In Hindu mythology, Yama serves as the lord of death, the first mortal who died, and thus became the guide for all who follow. Yama's domain is not a place of punishment for all, but rather a necessary stopping point where souls are judged and assigned their next journey, whether that's rebirth, liberation, or a period in one of the many heavens or hells. What's profound about Yama is that he's not separate from humanity, but arose from it. Death is not something imposed from without, but something intrinsic to the cycle of existence. Yama guards the threshold because he understands it intimately, having been the first to cross it. In Mexican tradition, particularly in the beliefs surrounding Dia de los Muertos, the dead return to visit annually, but their passage is facilitated by elaborate ofrendas, altars laden with photos, favorite foods, marigold flowers, and candles. The marigold's strong scent and bright color are meant to guide the spirits home, while the offerings sustain them during their visit. What unites all these guardians and traditions is a single understanding. Death is a threshold that demands respect, preparation, and proper guidance. You cannot simply walk across. You cannot force your way through. You must pay Charon, satisfy Anubis, be chosen by the Valkyries, honor Yama, respect the torii, build the ofrenda. Every culture developed elaborate systems to ensure the boundary was maintained while allowing for necessary crossings in the proper way. And implicit in all these myths is a warning. Try to cross the threshold improperly. Try to reach across from one side to the other without following the rules, and there will be consequences. Which brings us to the next pattern in humanity's threshold myths. The danger of looking where we shouldn't look, of turning back when we should continue forward, of refusing to accept that some boundaries cannot be breached by love or will alone. Perhaps no myth better captures the danger of breaking threshold rules than the story of Orpheus, the musician whose love for his wife Eurydice led him to attempt the impossible, to bring her back from the land of the dead. You likely know the story. Eurydice dies of a snake bite on her wedding day. Orpheus, grief-stricken and unable to accept her loss, does what the myths tell us not to do. He journeys while still living into the underworld. His music is so beautiful that it charms even Charon, even Cerberus, even Hades himself. The Lord of the Dead makes a bargain. Orpheus can lead Eurydice back to the world of the living, but he must not look back at her until they have both emerged into the sunlight. We know how it ends. Just before reaching the surface, Orpheus turns to look at Eurydice to ensure she's still following, and she vanishes back into the depths forever. He has broken the one condition, violated the threshold rule, and the cost is absolute. He loses her, not once but twice. Every culture has a version of this story, and they all carry the same warning. Love does not give you the right to violate death's boundaries. Grief does not excuse breaking the rules. The threshold must be respected, even when everything in your heart screams to turn back, to look, to reach across and pull your beloved back into the light. In Japanese mythology, Izanagi makes the same mistake. His wife, Izanami, dies giving birth to the fire god. Izanagi cannot accept her loss and follows her to Yomi, the shadowy land of the dead. Izanami agrees to return with him, but she makes him promise not to look at her until they reach the surface. Izanagi, impatient and fearful, lights a torch and looks at his wife's decaying form. Horrified and ashamed, Izanami is transformed into something terrible and chases him from the underworld. The threshold between life and death is sealed with a massive boulder, never to be breached again by the living. The pattern repeats across cultures. In Polynesian mythology, Maui tries to conquer death itself by crawling through the sleeping body of Hinenui Tepo, the goddess of night and death, attempting to reverse the direction of birth and thus grant humanity immortality. But the watching birds laugh at the absurd sight, waking the goddess, who crushes Maui to death. Again, the message is clear. Death's threshold cannot be reversed, cannot be tricked, cannot be undone by cleverness or love or courage. The biblical story of Lot's wife turning to look back at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah carries the same weight. She's told not to look back, not to witness what is being left behind. But she cannot resist. She turns and is transformed into a pillar of salt, forever frozen at the threshold between the old life and the new, unable to move forward, unable to return. Why are these stories so consistent across cultures? Because they speak to a profound human struggle, the difficulty of letting go, of accepting loss, of moving forward without looking back. The forbidden glance is not just about respecting supernatural rules. It's about accepting that some things cannot be undone, that death is final, that clinging to what's gone prevents us from continuing forward. But there's another layer to these myths, one that becomes especially relevant when we consider the Victorian spiritualism that the historian has documented and the Edinburgh that the wanderer has shown us. These stories warn not just about looking back at the dead, but about attempting to see the dead at all, to make them visible when they should remain unseen. The ancient Greek myth of Medusa embodies this danger. She was once beautiful, but after being violated in Athena's temple, she was transformed into a gorgon, whose gaze turned any who looked upon her to stone. Medusa became a creature of the threshold between life and death, because to see her was to die instantly, to be frozen forever in the moment of looking. Perseus defeats her by looking not at her directly, but at her reflection in his polished shield. This detail is crucial. Direct sight is deadly, but reflected sight, mediated sight, allows him to see her without being transformed. The myth suggests that some things must be viewed indirectly, that there are truths too dangerous to look at directly. Consider how this myth resonates with the spirit photography that the historian and wanderer have explored. The camera, like Perseus's shield, mediates vision. It captures what the eye cannot or should not see directly. The Victorians who flocked to spirit photographers were, in a sense, trying to safely view what should remain unseen, to look at the dead without being drawn into death themselves. In Irish mythology, the banshee serves as a threshold guardian of sound rather than sight. Her wail announces death's approach, but to actually see her is far more dangerous. She appears as a woman washing bloody clothes in a stream, and those who stumble upon her are marked for death themselves. The lesson? Some heralds of death should be heard but not seen, acknowledged but not confronted directly. Jewish folklore speaks of the Dybbuk, a spirit that possesses the living because it cannot or will not cross the threshold of death properly. The Dybbuk clings to life, enters another person's body, speaks through their mouth. The exorcism rituals to remove a Dybbuk are essentially rituals to force the proper crossing of the threshold, to send the spirit where it should have gone in the first place. Chinese ghost stories are full of spirits that appear normal at first glance, but reveal themselves to be dead through small details. Feet that don't touch the ground, a face glimpsed in a mirror that doesn't match the person standing before you, a shadow that moves independently. These stories warn that the dead can appear among the living, but there are always signs if you know how to look. Always tells that reveal the boundary has been improperly crossed. The Maori people of New Zealand developed strict tapu rules around the dead, restrictions on touching, seeing, or speaking about the deceased in certain ways. To break these rules was to risk spiritual contamination, to blur the boundary between life and death in dangerous ways. The living had to be formally released from tapu through specific rituals before they could return to normal life after encountering the dead. African folklore across numerous cultures speaks of ancestors who must be properly honored and kept separate from the living world. Failure to perform the correct burial rites, failure to remember and honor the dead properly, can result in restless spirits that bring misfortune. But even properly honored ancestors maintain their distance, appearing in dreams rather than in waking life, speaking through divination rather than direct conversation. What emerges from all these varied traditions is a consistent understanding. Sight is powerful and dangerous when directed across the threshold between life and death. To see the dead is to risk being seen by them, to open a channel that flows both ways. The proper relationship with the dead involves memory, honor, ritual, but not direct vision, not face-to-face encounter. This is why the Victorian obsession with spirit photography and spirit cabinets, with making the dead visible, with capturing their images, was so transgressive from a mythological perspective. Every culture had developed elaborate systems for keeping sight and death separated, for honoring the dead while maintaining proper boundaries. The spiritualists attempted to violate these boundaries with their new technologies, their cameras and their cabinets, their séances and their mediums. And the myths suggest again and again that such violations carry a cost. Orpheus lost Eurydice. Izanagi was chased by his decaying wife. Lot's wife became salt. Those who gazed on Medusa turned to stone. The pattern is universal. Look where you should not look, and you will be changed or lost or frozen forever at the threshold you tried to cross. But humans are curious creatures. We have always tried to peer across the boundary, to catch glimpses of what lies beyond, which brings us to the tools we've created to help us cross, or to protect us from crossing, or to trick us into thinking we can see clearly what should remain veiled. Every culture that developed myths about death's threshold also developed physical objects meant to mediate the crossing, to protect the living, to guide the dead, or to serve as anchors between the two worlds. These objects reveal how seriously our ancestors took the boundary between life and death, how much thought and craft went into maintaining proper relations with what lies beyond. Start with the most universal, burial goods. Nearly every culture has buried or cremated the dead with objects meant to serve them in the afterlife. The Egyptians filled their tombs with everything the deceased might need, from furniture to food to golden treasures. The Vikings placed weapons and ships in burial mounds. The Chinese burned paper money and paper houses so the dead would have wealth and shelter in the spirit world. But these objects serve a dual purpose. They're gifts to the dead, yes, but they're also a way of saying, you have what you need. Now stay where you belong. The coin for Charon keeps the dead from wandering the shores. The food offerings at Japanese shrines ensure ancestors don't go hungry and return to bother the living. The elaborate tomb goods tell the dead, you are honored, you are remembered, you have no reason to return. Mirrors occupy a strange position in threshold mythology across cultures. In many traditions, mirrors must be covered or turned to the wall when someone dies. This practice appears in Jewish, Victorian British, African and Asian traditions with remarkable consistency. Why? Because mirrors are themselves thresholds, reflecting back a world that looks like ours, but isn't quite real, existing in a space that is both here and not here. When death occurs, when the boundary between worlds is already disturbed, mirrors become dangerous multipliers of that disturbance. They might trap the departing soul, or serve as portals for other spirits, or reflect things that should not be seen. In Chinese tradition, the Pakua mirror hangs above doorways, its octagonal shape inscribed with trigrams from the I Ching. These mirrors are meant to deflect evil spirits and negative energy, serving as threshold guardians for the living space. They reflect back what should not enter, creating a boundary of reflected light. Salt appears again and again as a threshold material. The Japanese scatter salt after funerals, on doorways, in corners, creating barriers that spirits cannot cross. In European folk traditions, a line of salt across a doorway keeps ghosts out. In Mexican tradition, salt is sometimes included in ofrendas, but carefully, because too much might keep the spirits away entirely, rather than guiding them home for their annual visit. Why salt? Perhaps because it preserves, keeps things from decaying, holds forms in place. In threshold magic, salt creates zones of preservation, spaces where the rules of one realm end and another's begin. Boundaries that even the dead respect. Iron holds similar power in Celtic and European traditions. Cold iron is said to disrupt fairy magic and keep spirits at bay. Horseshoes nailed above doors, iron nails driven into door frames, iron pokers left across thresholds, all these ward against the supernatural, create boundaries that should not be crossed. Iron is of the earth, forged by human craft, fundamentally antithetical to the ethereal nature of spirits. Bells serve as threshold markers in numerous traditions. Church bells, rung at the moment of death, help the departing soul find its way. Temple bells in Buddhist and Hindu traditions call the faithful to prayer, but also mark the boundaries of sacred space. The bell's sound travels between worlds, audible to both the living and the dead, making it a perfect tool for communication across the threshold. Water has long been understood as a threshold element. Rivers mark the boundary in Greek and many other mythologies. Water for washing the dead cleanses them for their journey, but also removes their connection to the living world. Holy water, blessed by priests, creates boundaries that evil spirits cannot cross. The living wash their hands after touching the dead, using water to sever the connection to return fully to the world of life. Flowers carry meaning across death's threshold. Marigolds for Dia de los Muertos, their strong scent guiding spirits home. White chrysanthemums in Japan and many Asian cultures, reserved exclusively for funerals because they are flowers of death. Lilies in Christian tradition, symbolizing resurrection, but also marking the presence of death. Their heavy scent filling funeral homes and churches. These flowers serve as both invitation and boundary marker. Come here, cross safely, but know that this is a threshold space, that death is present, that proper respect must be maintained. Candles and lamps light the way between worlds in nearly every tradition. The yard-side candle burns for 24 hours in Jewish mourning, marking time while the soul makes its journey. Eternal flames burn in temples and churches, never allowed to go out, maintaining a constant connection to the divine and the dead. Jack-o'-lanterns, originally carved from turnips in Irish tradition, were meant to guide lost souls or ward them away, depending on whether they were family or stranger. These flames create zones of light and darkness, visible from both sides of the threshold, serving as beacons or barriers, depending on intention. Incense carries prayers and messages to the dead in Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, and Catholic traditions. The smoke rises, crosses the boundary between earth and heaven, between physical and spiritual. The scents themselves, sandalwood, frankincense, myrrh, are chosen for their sacred qualities. Their ability to purify space and facilitate communication with what lies beyond. Drums and gongs in various traditions serve to drive away evil spirits or call good ones. In shamanic practices across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, the drum's beat accompanies journeys between worlds, its rhythm providing a lifeline back to the physical realm, while the shaman's consciousness travels across the threshold. The drum serves as both vehicle and anchor, allowing controlled crossing while preventing the traveler from being lost in the space between worlds. Photographs, in their earliest days, were understood by some cultures as threshold objects themselves, As the Wanderer's Edinburgh story illustrates, the camera captures what the eye sees, but fixes it in a medium that persists after the moment has passed, after the person has died. In this sense, every photograph is a small act of preservation against time and death, a keeping of what should fade. This is why some cultures feared being photographed, believing the camera captured part of the soul, why some refused to have their images taken, why some insisted photographs of the dead must be handled with ritual care. The photograph exists between the living moment and the preserved memory, neither fully present nor fully past. And then came the Victorian spiritualists, who took this understanding and pushed it further, claiming their cameras and their cabinets and their séance tables could not just preserve the dead, but communicate with them, could not just remember, but reveal. The historian has shown us how the craft of these objects worked, how cabinet makers like Jonathan Harrison built furniture with secret compartments, how spirit photographers mastered double exposure and chemical tricks. These were threshold tools of a new kind, designed not to maintain proper boundaries, but to deliberately blur them, to create the appearance of communication across a divide that all the old myths said should not be breached. What's fascinating is how these Victorian tools borrowed from and subverted traditional threshold objects. The spirit cabinet, like the ancient ark or the oracle's cave, created a liminal space where the supernatural could manifest. The photographic plate, like the mirror, captured reflections of what might or might not be there. The séance table, like the shaman's drum, was meant to facilitate journeys between worlds. But where traditional tools came wrapped in ritual, taboo, and centuries of accumulated wisdom about their proper use, these Victorian tools were commercialized, democratized, stripped of sacred context. Anyone with money could commission a spirit cabinet, could hire a photographer to capture their dead relative's ghost, could attend a séance, and place their hands on the table. The old myths would suggest this was dangerous, this removal of ritual and restriction, this treating of the threshold as a tourist attraction rather than a sacred boundary. And perhaps James Sinclair's sealed darkroom in Edinburgh, perhaps Jonathan Harrison's moral uncertainty in his London workshop. Perhaps these stories suggest the myths were right to warn us. In many of our stories tonight, the ritual of the crossing is crucial in determining the type of spirit we become. In those tales, there are two types of spirits. The peaceful dead are those who have crossed properly, and the restless dead who linger because something went wrong. The peaceful dead become ancestors. They are honored, remembered, invoked for blessing and guidance, but they remain on their side of the boundary. They do not intrude, they do not demand, they rest. The restless dead become ghosts. They appear where they shouldn't, cling to places or people, repeat actions endlessly, cause disturbance. Something keeps them from crossing fully, from finding peace. And the myths tell us, again and again, what that something is. In Chinese tradition, ancestors who are properly honored and remembered through ritual maintain a benevolent presence in family life. Their tablets sit on household altars, offerings are made on appropriate days. Their names are spoken with respect. They have crossed the threshold, but remain connected through love and memory. But hungry ghosts, those who died violently, or were never properly buried, or have no descendants to remember them. These wander endlessly, consuming but never satisfied. They are trapped in the threshold itself, unable to move forward, unable to return. The difference is not in how they died. It's in whether the living performed the necessary rituals, whether they let go properly, whether both sides accepted the separation that death demands. In Irish folklore, the difference between a fairy and a ghost is sometimes blurred, but the underlying pattern remains. The peaceful dead join the fairy folk in the other world, occasionally visiting on specific holy days, but never haunting, never demanding. The troubled dead appear in specific locations, repeating the moments of their death, unable to move beyond the trauma that killed them or the grief that binds them. Korean ghost stories distinguish between josang, honored ancestors who bring good fortune to their descendants, and gwishin, ghosts bound to the living world by unfinished business or improper burial. The josang have been released through proper funeral rites and ongoing remembrance. The gwishin remain trapped because something was left undone. What these myths reveal is that ghosts are what happens when the threshold isn't properly crossed, when the boundary between life and death becomes confused or violated. They are symptoms of broken ritual, interrupted mourning, or, and this is crucial, the living's refusal to let go. In Japanese folklore, the yurei often appear because of strong emotions at death, rage, sorrow, love, that tie them to the living world. But they can be released through specific rituals that acknowledge their pain, complete their unfinished business, or most importantly, convince them that they are released from earthly obligations. Someone must give them permission to go. The living must say, "You are loved, you are remembered, but you must go now. We release you. We will carry you in memory, but not in presence." This is what proper funeral rites do across cultures. They give the living a change to say goodbye to those they've lost, and they give the dead permission to complete the crossing. But some have turned grief into industry, mourning into performance, the boundary into something to be breached repeatedly, rather than crossed once with proper respect. The myths warn against this. Orpheus looks back and loses Eurydice forever, not just once, but twice, because his refusal to let go multiplies the loss. In Norse mythology, Balder dies and goes to hell, and though the gods love him desperately, they cannot bring him back. Even Odin, who can traverse all 9 worlds, cannot permanently breach death's boundary to restore his beloved son. The lesson is consistent. The dead must be released. Holding on too tightly transforms them from ancestors into ghosts, transforms our love into chains that bind them to a threshold they should have crossed. In West African traditions, ancestors become part of a continuous spiritual community, consulted and honored, but never summoned inappropriately, never asked to return to embodied life. They have their realm, the living have theirs, and the boundary between is maintained through specific rituals performed at specific times. To violate this boundary, to try to make the dead present in ways that blur their separation from life, risks creating confusion for both the living and the dead. The living cannot move forward, cannot create new relationships, cannot fully inhabit their own lives when constantly trying to maintain connection with those who have gone. The dead cannot rest, cannot complete their own journey, cannot exist peacefully in whatever state death brings. Ghost stories, then, are cautionary tales about what happens when we refuse proper grief, when we insist on presence instead of memory, when we try to reverse death's direction instead of accepting its necessity. The ghost is not the villain of these stories. The ghost is the victim of violence or improper burial, or most often, of love that won't release. So if clinging creates ghosts, how do we honor the dead without binding them to us and the realm of the living? How do we grieve properly without succumbing to its weight? How do we live with loss? The myths offer guidance here too. They show us that memory is sacred, that honoring is necessary, but we must balance these with the loving act of letting go, with acceptance that the dead have gone to a place we cannot follow until our own time comes. This delicate balance between grief and letting go appears in practices worldwide. The Islamic tradition limits mourning to specific periods, after which the living are expected to return to normal life. This isn't coldness, it's wisdom. Grief that never ends creates a vicious cycle, where the living cannot move forward and the dead cannot rest. In Finnish tradition, the concept of loili refers to the spirit or life force. When discussing the dead, there's recognition that their loili has departed. Their life force has gone, but they remain part of the family's story, part of the land's memory. They are not present, but they are not forgotten. The myths collected across millennia and preserved through countless retellings suggest that grief is necessary and right, but it must have structure, must have limits. We honor the dead not by refusing to let them go, but by carrying them forward in the right way, in story and memory, in how they've changed us, in the wisdom they've passed on. This is how ancestors rest and ghosts are prevented. This is how we live with loss without being destroyed by it. This is how love continues beyond death without violating death's necessary boundary. We remember, we honor, we carry forward, and we let go of presence even as we keep the influence, the love, and the lesson learned from those we've lost. As we approach the end of our journey tonight, consider what all these myths have been teaching us. The boundary between life and death is not arbitrary. It's recognition that different states of being require different spaces, and that both the living and the dead need the freedom to continue their separate journeys. The myths about forbidden glances speak to the psychological necessity of letting go. Orpheus lost Eurydice twice because he couldn't simply walk forward. His very love became the thing that doomed them both. The guardian figures, Charon, Anubis, the Valkyries, are not villains, but necessary functions maintaining order, ensuring that neither the living nor the dead are trapped in eternal limbo. Think about James Sinclair in the Edinburgh dark room that the Wanderer visited, where cameras truly captured spirits. His decision to seal it was not cruelty, but wisdom, recognition that some thresholds, once opened carelessly, become difficult to close. Consider Jonathan Harrison, the cabinet maker the historian introduced us to, whose craft served both comfort and fraud. The moral ambiguity of threshold work, where helping and harming blur together. And here in my collection, myths from every culture saying the same thing in different voices. The threshold is real, the boundary matters, yet humans have always wanted to peer beyond the veil, to maintain connection with what we've lost. This desire isn't wrong, it's deeply human. The myths simply warn about pursuing it improperly, without respect for the forces involved. Perhaps this is what these myths ultimately teach, that letting go is not forgetting, but the deepest form of love, releasing someone fully to whatever comes next, while honoring what was shared. This October convergence has been unusual for our library. The Wanderer's alternate histories, the historian's records of Victorian craft, and my ancient myths all explored the same essential truth from different directions. How to live well with loss. How to respect boundaries while maintaining connection through memory, rather than desperate clinging. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have enjoyed this narration for sleep, I invite you to return. Each week, I'll be here with different myths from my glowing shelves. The historian will continue sharing forgotten crafts, and the wanderer will walk other timelines. But perhaps when boundaries blur again, we three keepers will find ourselves drawn together, discovering that our separate collections illuminate the same human truths. Until we meet again, may you carry the myth's wisdom with you, that boundaries are necessary, that love endures, even when presence does not, and that the guardians remain at their posts, maintaining the threshold between worlds. Sleep well, dear listener, and good night.